Alright folks, after careful deliberation, it turns out that we're going to have to curb the enthusiasm just a little bit. So the AM platform was a little too enthusiastic and too optimistic, so we're just going to reel that in just a little bit and throw it out the window. Instead, we're going to go with an LGA 1200 from Intel with the 11th generation Intel CPU, and we're going to talk about it. So disregard the RAM and the storage devices. They're just on there to make sure that everything was working. So we're not really counting that towards the budget, and we're not really including that into the final build. However, let's just talk about the motherboard. The motherboard itself is a PD500TC, which was pulled from an Asus ProArt workstation. And for an LGA 1200, B650, I believe. Hold on. Sorry, it's a B560. It is still a somewhat very capable motherboard. It features PCI Express 16 Gen 4, 2 PCI Express 3 1.1, PCI Express 3 times 1, up to 128 gigs of RAM, and 2 M.2 slots. So you're probably thinking, what is the drawback of this motherboard, and why is it all of a sudden that I'm going from AM5 to LGA 1200, which is a expired platform? Well, if you haven't really looked at the news recently, motherboards are jumping in price, and RAM isn't coming down. Now, I thought I could probably get away with a little bit of e-waste RAM and call it a day, but that's no longer the case. There's a guy who locally is selling DDR4 3200 megahertz, which is exactly what I'm looking for this motherboard. However, for the 64 gig kit, he wants $600. That is insane. And you're probably thinking, oh, why don't I go with like a smaller quantity and stuff like that? And well, they're 16 gig sticks. So even if I did want to go with a smaller quantity, I would still have to pay $300, which is half of the build's budget anyways. So then you're thinking, oh, why don't I just get slower RAM and call it a day? Well, because yours truly messed up when I was looking at the specs for the motherboard. It doesn't have XMP profiles. So whatever you put, that's what it's going to run at. When I was looking at the specs, I ignored that it's a workstation motherboard, but running on a consumer chipset, and that's what's going to bite me in the ass. However, I did get the motherboard and the CPU for just under $200. Anyways, we'll see you in the next one.